Welcome to this week's news program. I'm your host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Today, helping me with this week's news is my co-anchor, Mr. Kevin Berglund. Thank you, Mr. Berglund, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, last week we were reporting on the joint committee meeting of the Maplewood City Council and the Housing and Economic Development Commission. This joint meeting was held at the Maplewood City Hall, and it was not cable cast, so the residents of Maplewood have no idea what is being discussed with regard to development, with regard to big plans, and with regard to the megalomaniacs at work at City Hall. Now, we had our cameras there, and for the last couple of shows, we have been able to share with you the insider comments of that meeting. Today, we will be concluding our report. We're going to be focusing primarily on the comments made with regard to the city's big plans for the redevelopment of the Gladstone neighborhood. Now, last news report, we shared with the viewers the prices that the city has been paying for various parcels of property in that area of Gladstone, in and around the Frost and English intersection. In many cases, the value of the parcel that's being purchased is substantially less than what the city has paid for it. And in several instances, the buildings that are on those properties will require demolition, which is an additional cost. So when the city is buying the property for greater than its value, plus they have all the demolition costs, well, indeed, it gets to be a pretty spendy project indeed. Now, Mr. Berglund, you were at this meeting, and you had a chance to hear these comments firsthand.
They're in the council chambers, but of course they don't have the cameras on. So the belief from the city officials is if there's no cameras, there's generally no viewing, and if somebody does happen to come up there, they would hardly remember what any of them said because there's no mics up there. So it gives you a little access to the power behind the throne in the city of Maplewood. And
with the way that they are setting up these meetings in the city council chambers, the individuals are sitting in a somewhat irregular circle, which also makes it hard for the public, if you do attend these meetings, to hear what people are saying because, as you indicated, there's no microphones, but all of these people, when they're speaking, their voice is projecting in towards the middle of the circle to each other, and that their backs are turned to the public, which is sort of symbolic of how this process is set up. Let's just turn our backs on the public. We can do it at the meeting. We can do it when we're coming to our development plans.
And of course, to put it in a nutshell, the council up there is very unwelcoming. Of course, when you got 3 of the council members who aren't elected, what is the motivation that the welcoming, positive attitude would actually be extended to the residents of Maplewood? Maplewood already, City of Maplewood administration, City of Maplewood Council already has a culture of high negativity of the public.
Now, where we left off last week was a film clip where they were talking about Sherman and Associates. Now, Sherman and Associates is the developer, their preferred developer that they recruited to go out and do the high-density housing there at the intersection of Frost and English. That was a couple of years ago that he was recruited to do that development. Now, certainly he bought the property, but he bought the property, generally speaking, with other people's money, not with his own money. So what he really is just a conduit for the government's development, because the money he's using is almost primarily all the government's money. But let's look in on that conversation from the meeting where they are talking about Sherman and Associates.
So the question is correct me if I'm wrong, there is still opportunities at Sherman Associates for another developer looks and says, wow, this is still a great, the reason Sherman, for what, those arguments are still there why we should build another apartment building. Is there land, is there an opportunity if a developer were to come forward and say, I want to buy land and be next to that savannah, is there an opportunity for them to do that?
There is, but it's with complications. And I think we're leading the best opportunities with the properties that we own. But the projects that we want to see in this neighborhood can't just occur on the properties we own. We need additional site assemblage, so we're working with property owners, working with the developer when they can buy the additional properties. There's still work to be done. And we know there's interest, especially with the rush line coming in. The city owns property right adjacent to, on the west side and then just down the road on the east side. There's interest in those. But the vision that we have for those sites, it's not there yet. So
The inquiry is, can we count on Sherman and Associates to continue to be the preferred developer, the conduit, so to speak, for the government initiative for the redevelopment of this corner of Gladstone? And we know from our audio that we have of the closed meeting that was held in 2018 when the city decided to buy the Moose Lodge for more than its market value, that in that meeting they actually contemplated that in buying that property, the Moose Lodge, that they were then going to then have the Sherman and Associates be their developer to do the development on that corner of the intersection of Frost and English as well. And that they already felt confident that they had that developer in the wings to do their bidding, even if they had to give him the property. And Mr. Berglund, you remember when the city attorney gave them caution in that closed meeting back in 2018 that if they buy the Moose Lodge property, it may turn out that they will have to either give a developer subsidies in order to encourage development the way the city wants it developed, or they will literally have to give the $1 million property away to the developer in order to get the kind of development that the city envisions. Not what the market demands, but what the city wants.
And I'm assuming that the city attorney in Maplewood was giving that caution to the city of Maplewood because it was already in the air, in the wind, probably from communications from Sherman and Associates.
Now, some of our viewers, Mr. Berglund, they may question our comments when we say that Sherman and Associates, when they went into developing that northwest corner of the intersection of Frost and English, that they really didn't put that much of their own money into it. They may question that. And they may say, well, what are your facts to back that up? We went back into our archives, and this is what we found. So right from the mouth of Sherman and Associates, this is what you'll hear of their investment.
Sherman and Associates, what's your value in this? I think it's about 12.5 million, is that correct? You could approach.
Shane LaFave with Sherman Associates. Yes, Mayor, that is the total development cost of the project, about 12.5 million of phase one.
Yeah, okay. So that's what you have into it. Is that regardless of the government investment and so forth, the grants?
12.5 million is the total development cost, including all sources of funds and for all the uses, all the acquisition, construction, all the soft costs, architects' fees, all of those things. Okay. So our contribution with this project is in the form of a deferred developer fee equity, and that's a few $100,000.
There you have it. So then Mayor Nora Slawick she goes at it thinking that the value of the project, 12.5 million, is what the developer has into the project. Come to find out, no, that's all other people's money. That really what the developer has into it is, well, somewhere around $300,000 out of 12.5 million. That gives you an indication that indeed there's not a lot of skin in the game, that it really is just at the bequest of the government and the government funding. The developer isn't doing this because the market demands it, because the market is going to pay him back. The market is not going to pay him back. It's the government that's paying him. Interesting, isn't it? Well, let's continue then as we now go back and fast forward to the meeting that we're covering, which is that joint meeting of the Maplewood City Council and the Housing and Economic Development Commission. There are several of the upper level city administrative staffs there, including Melinda Coleman, who is the city manager of Maplewood, who of course has had these housing plans for the Gladstone neighborhood since 2003 and 2004. At the time, back in 2006 and 7, her plans were dashed, they were shot down, they were thrown in the back room. But now that she's city manager and she has a different council, she's dusted them off and she's well on her way to getting those densities back up there again, especially since they've changed the comprehensive plan to change the density to 50 units per acre. Mr. Berglund, you think that at a density of 50 units per acre, they're going to get up to the 2,500 housing units at that intersection, aren't they?
I think that's the math that the city manager Melinda Coleman is counting on, because for whatever reason, I think she wants to do that calculation, trying to remake a neighborhood.
A resume builder. Yes, I indeed did all of this housing. Woohoo!
Well,
okay, now let's take a look at this next clip, which are her comments.
I would just say we have a plan for parcel acquisition. The ones we have, which ones we think are easier to get than others, and so that can be shared with you guys.
She kind of was looking over to the side a little bit, like a little bit over her shoulder to see if the camera was focused in on her while she was making her comments.
And up in the city of Maplewood, all those top city officials are always interested in what's going on in the press box.
Right. But now the facilitator of this meeting, the assistant city manager, he wants to bring them back all on focus and say, well, let's look at our poster board here and see if we're meeting our goals.
So Jeff, before I hand it over to you, I want to go back over to this list around some of our big picture why things. What Mike sort of described over at Gladstone, how does this fit with what our earlier conversation was with why? Does it seem to make sense? Does it seem to fit as a piece? What stands out? You're nodding your head, Brian. What do you have a part that stands out for you?
Revitalization. It was a neighborhood that I think was mentioned was a little tired, so the commercial aspect of it, right? So you've got new life, new construction, illumination of some tired buildings, and I think what the community wanted, right? Joy, I think you mentioned, right? They wanted that. They were afraid that Savannah was going to be turned into a housing development or something. So it just seems like everybody kind of won in that situation.
This member of the Housing and Economic Development Commission is relatively new to serving on these committees. I don't believe that he was involved with the Gladstone Coalition back in the mid-2000s that was working very diligently on the residence plan. And so when he says that this is what is being done is what is the will of what the neighbors wanted, of what the people wanted, he's only taking the word of the current people in power who have recrafted the history of the Gladstone redevelopment, because the plan that's being put in place now with 50 units per acre and 2,500 housing units concentrated in that central location of Frost and English is not the plan that the residents wanted.
In the city of Maplewood, whenever their officials or their surrogates, their administrators or the people they find say those words, what the people wanted or the wills of the people, your ears should automatically prick up because you know that's when the story begins. But of course, that is what bolsters whatever argument, whatever we prevail upon the Maplewood residents, whatever we push out. We're doing it not as the city administrators, not because we want to do it, because it's what the people of the area want. And of course, there's never any supporting material for that. There's never any surveys. There's no public comment into Maplewood. In my mind, it's all pretense.
And because public comment has been eliminated from the Maplewood City Council agenda, members of the public can't come forward and speak in a format, in a forum, where the public can hear that there is objection. They're asked that they must tweet them, or Facebook it, or send an email, call a city council member, or try to, catch them as they run out the door trying to avoid contact with the residents.
As you mentioned, the city of Maplewood, their council, it's basically the council of the Melinda Coleman. They never talk about the pros and cons. All they're interested is this kind of fake enthusiasm that the city, the Sherman Associates development there are all a huge, wonderful success. And Sherman Associates is so pleased to be part of this wonderful Maplewood.
I hear oftentimes in these comments is the false assumption that because you have construction, that it means that there is positive movement within the community, that it is being reinvigorated. But if the construction is simply being funded as through TIF, for instance, it may not have that same revitalization to it that they're trying to pretend it does. Just because you see new construction doesn't mean it's automatically revitalization. Now, in this next clip, they're going to be talking about, what is really the focus of this redevelopment to the Gladstone area? I mean, why are we trying to do this? Anyway, let's take a look.
Others?
Well, when we talked over here, Kathy, around people attraction of people, keeping people here, but also attracting new people.
One of the purposes is to attract new residents. I find oftentimes the reason that people are attracted to a community is because it's close to where they work. Now, if Maplewood isn't focusing on trying to encourage good paying jobs being developed or nurtured or being imported into Maplewood, then that means that the people who live in Maplewood actually have to go out of Maplewood to go to employment. And what about the school district? And is the school district what they're looking for? That's another reason that you attract people to your community. But Mr. Berglund, do you see the irony? Here they are trying to attract all these new residents by increasing the density, 50 units per acre, over, several thousand units, and yet they're closing the fire station, the medical response team, their station only 2 blocks away from this massive increase in population density. Does that seem to be consistent planning?
The city of Maplewood has all kinds of planners. It would only seem rational and natural that if you bring more people in the area, more people who need public services for whatever reason, you're going to need more medical capabilities nearby. And it seems to be an the just wrongful way of doing things. And you wonder, what is the president's mind up there with the city officials in Maplewood? Everything seems to be going backwards.
You bring up this conflict between the fact that you have increases in population, and generally in all communities, and I think even from our film footage that we've shown from our own Maplewood paramedic department, that increases in population results in increases in calls for service. And the department the fire department, which predominantly reports to 80 to 85% of its calls are medical calls, has consistently stated year after year that those numbers of medical calls continue to increase. And they continue to increase in part because of an increase in population, but also an increase in the population of Maplewood becoming more elderly. And so if you hear the council members in this meeting talking about, yes, we could have more high-density development, especially for seniors, and yet they're closing down then the station that provides those medical services to respond to calls for service for medical assistance, that doesn't make sense. But the appointed mayor, Marley Abrams, will tell you that this is all very intentional, that these decisions, this development is all very intentional. So let's take a look and see if she knows what she's talking about.
I was going to say that this discussion is all very intentional, that successful development doesn't happen just by chance. And I think that because we're spending so much time talking about this, that we will have that roadmap, and that will then, that's how you accomplish visions, is by having a roadmap and by being very intentional. And I think Gladstone is just an exciting opportunity for our city.
Exciting opportunity for a city. Now these again are marketing words. These are not words of an intentional plan of anything. Pure marketing gibberish. The camera is there focused on her. She knows it. It's an opportunity to get the marketing pitch out there. It's intentional and it's an opportunity. Woohoo! I'm so excited.
It seems like the appointed mayor is trying to find something that would promise the residents the moon. This is so exciting because it's so intentional. Intentional meaning planning, I guess. Planning is what brings the intentionality. Yet the fire station, 2 blocks away from Frost and English, they're going to close, and the nearest fire station is going to be out by Maplewood Mall. That is intentional. Now, of course, one wonders, okay, maybe you don't need any medical response for what you're intentionally trying to do, because maybe we're just going to put 20-year-olds in all these units and we don't need medical responses. But I've never heard, there has to be some sort of rationale behind all this craziness up there, isn't it?
Well, we don't know because they don't explain their intentional decisions in front of the camera. Now, in the next clip, we're going to be finding out that really maybe all of this is hinged on, the bus rapid transit. That maybe the big intention after all is to bolster the bus rapid transit, or is it the other way around? That because of the bus rapid transit, we're going to have this need for housing. Or do we have to put in the housing first before we get the BRT? It's a chicken and an egg, but let's take a look.
So I want to say let me say it applies to 2 sections on there. Obviously, I think the first one is connecting people. one of the other things we need to look at, and this is where Rush Line's a perfect example, is as much as we want to connect people in Maplewood with Maplewood, this connects Maplewood to the rest of the metro too. This goes to that, bringing employees in, taking residents to their jobs. It brings visitors in. But I will also say, it's a little bit of an example of us maybe not being, I mean, I know we did it 20 years ago, but I don't know if we were as proactive on that as we could have been, taking into account how long.
That's Mark Jenkins, who lives in South Maplewood. And he is the chair of the Housing and Economic Development Commission. He's talking about, well, maybe, we should have had the BRT going through here 20 years ago. That would have changed things. Except that he also is going against those assumptions that says that somehow Maplewood isn't connected to the rest of the metro through the mass transit system. I think there's been bus service in Maplewood as long as I can remember. And Mr. Berglund, you were born in Maplewood. Have they always had buses?
They've actually had always had buses. While some suburban communities have very few buses, Maplewood has always had, being a first-ring suburb, access to a lot of buses. Now, of course, has anybody really wanted to use them? They certainly are using them less and less and less as people are getting more interested in alternative forms of transportation if they don't personally have the car, which many, many families do, especially many of the new Gladstone residents. A lot of Hmong families have the car. They have other alternatives, Uber, ride sharing, Lyft, etc., which most people look at preferential and safer than the bus system. But as this gentleman says, this is a perfect example of how we're going to bring employees in. Now, when they bring employees in to Frosted English, there's no longer the Maplewood Bowl anymore. Maybe they're thinking, the bakery, the Maplewood Bakery. Oh, I forgot Melinda Coleman, I think, would like to get rid of the Maplewood Bakery too. But of course, it's going to be the tourists who are coming in to see the Savannah there, the historical Savannah that they clear cut. Oh no, maybe there's going to be a lot of bike riders to ride the Bruce Vento Environmental Trail. Oh, I forgot. Melinda Coleman and her gang up there want to clear cut and decimate all the trees and the wildlife.
And maybe,
perfect example.
Yeah, or maybe it's so that people from St. Paul can ride the BRT up to the Maplewood Mall for a day of shopping. Oh no, the North End recommendations recommends that 50% of that whole commercial retail area be demolished and turned into high-density housing. You could go see your Aunt Matilda, I guess. Next is Mr. Mark Jenkins continuing his comments regarding how he views the Gladstone area redevelopment similarly to that redevelopment in Oakdale off of 494 and 10th Street. Let's take a look.
Yeah, I think it's it's a grocery store now, but Oakdale had that little mall up on 15th or 10th.
Hy-Vee?
That, yeah, it's a Hy-Vee now, but the owner just wouldn't get rid of it. But man, that thing would have been prime redevelopment, definitely 20 years earlier than what it was. And being proactive can help us overcome that gap between when it's ready and then when we're ready to fix it.
So in other words, two things from that clip. One, he seems to think that that location in Oakdale is somehow akin to the Gladstone neighborhood. The Gladstone neighborhood is actually a residential neighborhood where there's just a couple of little mom and pop type shops in a residential neighborhood. that redevelopment area in Oakdale is off of a major transportation corridor. If you've been up there, there's a whole lot more than the Hy-Vee. There's a Cub store, there's banks, there's other stores, retail, pizza, everything you would ever need. It's like going to a big metropolitan mall area. So it's not really quite the same. The other takeaway, Mr. Berglund, you notice, is that his attitude is that if the property owner isn't doing what the government wants that property owner to do with the property, that somehow or other the government should become proactive, intervene, and force that property owner to go do what the government thinks is the best and highest use to that land. I think that that falls right into our last program where we talked about the megalomaniacs at work at City Hall. It's the same kind of attitude.
And it is kind of confusing to believe that Melinda Coleman is more knowledgeable about real estate than somebody who owns a big property who probably has people working for them on what the future of that property is. I know that we know that these are the bestest, brightest, and that there is, maybe in the Twin Cities, when you got the city manager Melinda Coleman and Mary Abrams and Brian Smith, and that they are going to have a new paradigm shift where they're going to promise everybody the moon, and the only thing that all their failure so far can be accounted for is their timing was off by 20 years. And I'm thinking this property over the old Oakdale Mall, that's over by, like you said, 494, and it's only, I think, less than a mile from 3M, versus the Gladstone, which there is the Maplewood Bakery there. There's not a dollar store yet, but there's something which actually generally has a little higher prices than the dollar store. There's a little grocery store over there. Other than that, I guess there's a few liquor stores around. And yet this is a kind of economic opportunity that this whole grand superstructure of the great planners of Maplewood is going to build on.
Next, they're going to be talking about the timeline and the assistant city manager who's facilitating this is trying to get the team back on track.
Dialogue has been really rich, and I don't want to lose that kind of conversation. So I'm going to go back to this little flip chart that says Gladstone on there. And so as we think about the plan that's in place and the things that are already sort of existing with the development that's already occurred with Sherman and so the other opportunities for acquisition for additional properties to make site assemblage larger and more attractive to the marketplace. What are some of the things in the next 2 years that you would like to physically see different? Whether it's a shovel in the ground or a property acquisition that's been made or a revised plan. What's something that we can point to?
There we saw the assistant city manager trying to bring everybody back on track to the poster board. And let's talk about Gladstone. We got to get a few things on our poster board to make it look like we're accomplishing something. It's sort of like that construction that gets done through TIF financing. It looks like you're getting something done, but did you really get anything done at all? It depends on the long-term analysis.
And that gentleman in the white shirt standing in front of the easel there, he's a very recent new employee, the assistant city manager of Maplewood, Mike Stable. And he has there's another new employee who is fairly recent, and he is head of community development. Now, these two gentlemen, they're new. Melinda Coleman hired him, the city manager. You can see that all they want to do is, despite having very little knowledge of the area, very little background, very little idea of what Maplewood Gladstone area is, what the trends are, they just want to please their boss. They're just little sidekicks to Melinda Coleman. Now, the question is, I'm assuming that even these appointed council members who are just in the bag of Linda Coleman, I think they should actually be able to see, because some of these people have been residents of Maplewood, that these two gentlemen are adding very little to this whole discussion.
Except they too don't speak up because they're appointed, and they too want to please the folks who appointed them. And they too want not to be seen as rocking the boat, because if they're choosing to run for election this fall, they want to make sure that their fellow buddies on the council who appointed them are going to endorse them for the election coming up this fall. And we do know from having attended the DFL caucuses that Sylvia is planning on running for election this fall. She's one of the appointed council members. She's not going to speak up and make it a point of being the one to ask questions. No, heaven forbid, that would be like suicide going to election. You can't do that.
And of course, these council members who are appointed, all they want to do is sing praises to heaven or sing praises to the city, because they want the city's resources, their newsletter, their public relation arms, to be their campaign vehicle in the elections. We'll let the guys on the outside, who are the challengers, run their little one bicycle show, while we'll have the resources of the taxpayers and the city officials applauding us and clapping us. Wow, we would like the choir of City Hall and Melinda Coleman's sidekicks singing praises to these people, and put the little guy who's trying to advocate for the city, the David, on the outside, on the fringe.
Yes, peace and tranquility abounds in Maplewood. Now let's take a look at our next clip, where appointed Mayor Marley Abrams is asked about what timeline she'd like to see for Gladstone. Remember, she's one of the megalomaniacs up at City Hall.
I want to see phase 3. I have been fortunate enough to have been on the council for each one of the phases, and it has been absolutely exciting to see that happen. I'd like to see that. Now that is driven by outside forces. That's driven by Sherman and what they plan to do with the property that they own. So we talked about the fact that there are some of these things that we have ownership and that we have control over, and there are other things that, you know, it's driven by developers and it's driven by the market. So I would like to see phase 3 completed with.
This is a phony baloney statement. Phase 3 of the Sherman and Associates project is under the umbrella of the tax increment financing that the city gave to Sherman and Associates. They have a timeline, and so when she says that the city has no control over that, I think they just voted on having that third phase fall under that umbrella, and that there are timelines under that TIF that was granted. I think they do have control. And there is a developer's agreement that goes in place between the city and Sherman and Associates. For her to say that all what Sherman does is based upon the market, that is a false statement completely and utterly, because what is Sherman and Associates is doing is based upon the government tools they have at their disposal.
And the government is loaded with all kinds of tools in their toolbox. But I think Mary Abrams, the mayor, the appointed mayor, should just be saying, don't blame us for all these poor public decisions, for all this expensive pie-in-the-sky, promise of the moon development we're going to be to Gladstone. Blame the guy behind the tree, Sherman.
Or maybe it's blame it on the market forces. That's what I heard, is that we don't have any control, blame it on the market forces, when it's not the market forces at work here. If the market forces were at work, Maplewood would not have paid more than the market value for the Moose Lodge, and they would not have used government money to do so to outbid a private entity that was also bidding on that property but had to stop basically because they're constrained by market value if they're looking to get a loan from a bank. So you see, market forces are not a consideration at City Hall. Now let's continue with the discussion of the timeline.
And I would like to see us have further acquisitions so that we are actively, we've got property that we can market within 2 years. And within 2 years, I would really like to see someone, I'd like to see a number of people being very interested in purchasing that. You know, on top of all of this, the timeline for the rush line is that there'd be shovels in the ground in 2024 and completion in 2026. So this is a very timely discussion. But those are two things, one from the outside and one thing that we can control and have that as a focus so that we have another piece of property that is prepared, ready for a developer to then get going on it.
So in her timeline, she wants some of these parcels that Maplewood purchased to be listed and offered for sale. You know, some of these properties they purchased, well, one they purchased in 2017. They could list that one for sale right now. It doesn't have any structures on it other than a dilapidated garage building, which isn't much to take down. They have another little parcel that they bought about the same time or so that has no buildings on it. It's right next to Sherman and Associates. And then they've got two properties that have big demolition projects on them where they have to get rid of the building. So certainly if they wanted to start listing properties for sale, they could do that. So again, why is she saying this when this is all things that could have been done, should have been done? You know, it's not like it's really part of that intentional planning that she insists that they're doing. Now, let's take a look then at our next clip.
Right now, isn't the property just kind of disjointed, and that's why developers are having...
That's why we need more acquisition. We need, and there's a plan to do that, to make bigger parcels, to purchase other land. That's what Melinda was talking about, that there is a plan to do that. I would like us to take some action on that, because we already have some property there that it seems to me that that is just ripe for a push.
So it's ripe for a push. Now we hear from Joy, who's on the Housing and Economic Development Commission, starting to question, what are we talking about properties the city owns? Because you see this, the city council never really shared any of that information with the Housing and Economic Development Commission. They didn't ask for their advice. They didn't ask for the recommendations to buy those properties or anything at all about it. They just went and they did it based upon, well, city manager Melinda Coleman wanted to do so. So that's what they did. So Joy is asking some questions about this, and appointed Mayor Marley Abrams is just brushing it off and saying, well, it's like Melinda Coleman said, you know, we've got some properties, we got to move along, and we're going to get more properties. They're going to get more properties. It's time for a push to buy more properties in the Gladstone area. Wow. That's why we have our cameras there. Let's continue.
And Ellie can talk about this too, but we have money in next year's CIP for land acquisition. Yeah, not this year, but in 2021 we have money.
I see merely at this stage that investment in more land will come bring it quickly to the early days until it's a little tougher.
Yeah.
Once this thing is up and running, it's an incremental piece. It makes sense.
That gentleman is appointed City Council member Bill Knutson. During these meetings, he has said little or nothing because he doesn't have any background in any of the discussions for the most part, because he's appointed. He wasn't part of what was going on in the past. He doesn't live in the Gladstone neighborhood. He's not familiar with the Gladstone neighborhood. He has a little bit more knowledge when it comes to the St. John's Hospital, considering he had been a past administrator. And so anything having to do with St. John's and putting a hotel up by St. John's, he's all for. And certainly that city plan he thinks sounds really sniffy. But this plan for Gladstone, as you heard him say, well, it sounds like you guys been doing some good thinking. Sounds like a good plan. Okay, goodbye me. Goodbye me. Now we hear from Kathleen Juniman. She's the city council member who's been on the council the longest. Mr. Berglund, what, 15 years? 16 years? I don't know. We can't count how many years. Well, let's take a look at Kathy Juniman, and we're going to hear her very short comments, but it's going to be quite an insider look into what's going on.
But our original thought was we'd be further along by now, and then maybe we'd have a spots to choose in the fall. We are that far.
Our original thought was that we would be much further along than we are. Mr. Berglund, at what city council meeting, workshop, or retreat have we ever captured them talking about their timeline on how far along they would be in the Gladstone redevelopment after buying all these parcels?
You never have.
She says, we thought, we means all of them collectively, discussing outside of the public eye, which is a violation of the open meeting law. Let's take a look at our next clip.
Asked, a couple people said, how do we do it? A couple things immediately jump to mind. I have a friend who does public relations for a number of things. One of the projects he worked on during the Green Line, that's the one that goes St. Paul, Minneapolis, right?
Yep.
I never get the colors right. Anyway, on that one, they did I think it was Met Council and MnDOT did a marketing campaign for the businesses during the construction. So part of that is, let's tell people they're there. The other piece I think of, and I think our council did a very good job on this many years ago, I can't remember what year it was, but Oakdale wanted to completely redevelop their land with Maplewoods east of 3M complex. Maplewood did the right thing in not just evicting good businesses. Some have gotten better, thankfully.
There again, we've got that philosophy that if we don't like a couple of businesses, we're just going to figure out a way to evict them. Wow. Is that right? Is that the role of government to do that and decide, well, I look at my city as a monopoly board game and I decide what businesses are using their property in the right and proper way that we as the government decide is the way we want our board to look? That is awful. That is awful. Now, you brought up the issue of grocery stores, that in the Gladstone neighborhood, there's a little neighborhood mom and pop grocery store. And the folks who are in the neighborhood, they use it from time to time. Let's hear where the discussion is in this group, in this meeting, about grocery stores in the Gladstone neighborhood.
And I think part of it is making sure as we build that plan for that road, we don't invite an Aldi in or a big box grocer, but we, do what we can to promote the grocers that are there. I think there's there's a lot of service-oriented businesses there. Try to keep them in mind as we do that development and, don't put in a national chain cost cutter, or hair cutters or whatever on those roads. Keep them in mind. What are businesses that are complementary? I have an idea what I would love to see there, but I want to ask Joy because I don't live there. What about, I'm going to say a community gathering space, and it could be a coffee, it could be a coffee shop, it could be a restaurant with a bar, but something where the neighbors can get together, you know, and have a cup of coffee, lunch together.
That's phase 3.
I think phase
Is there
3, there's
something like
a
that?
drive-through.
There is a coffee shop in 3. Okay,
Well,
I agree.
it's a drive-through, so I'm assuming coffee shop?
So now Mr. Mark Jenkins is talking about the types of businesses he wants to see in the Gladstone neighborhood. Heaven forbid, though, it be an Aldi's or a big box. And then he wants to have a coffee shop where people can hang around and drink coffee. Okay. And then somebody interjects, well, they're going to have a drive-through, as if, well, we're all going to congregate around the drive-through.
Right.
I don't know. You see, here is the conflict, is that generally speaking, when you're talking about big box retailers, or somebody like Aldi's or Cub or any of the other, Hy-Vee, they all have corporate standards by which they govern their decisions on whether or not they're going to locate a store in a particular area. And it generally almost never involves locating your business, your Hy-Vee, your Aldi's, your Cub, your Target, your Walmart, any of the other big boxes, in a predominantly neighborhood, residential neighborhood like Gladstone. Whether the BRT is going to stop there or not, that is still a residential neighborhood, because Maplewood has zoned it to be predominantly a residential neighborhood. Because with all that housing, once it's developed, there will be very little room for any commercial commerce at all. So this idea that Aldi's would even fathom coming to Gladstone is preposterous. That isn't even the way it works. But that's how it would work over there where the Hy-Vee is over in Oakdale.
Right.
Because that's a transportation corridor. But let's take a look at our next clip.
Yeah,
Okay.
right now, a coffee shop is not going to identify.
Well, then I agree with your first point.
And they wanted to have a drive-through approved before we.
Before we follow the
List of all the options.
On the edge of the neighborhood on White Bear, the Starbucks just opened.
Again, more discussion about whether or not there's going to be this drive up or we're going to have a place to sit down and have coffee. And if they were to talk about the demographics of the Gladstone neighborhood with regard to income and the age demographics, they might find that those demographics are inconsistent with the demographics that's needed for the type of glorified coffee shop that they have in their mind. But they never address that, do they, Mr. Berglund?
They address nothing in terms of who's living in Gladstone.
Now, we're going to jump to clip number 40, and this is where City Manager Melinda Coleman, she wants to get away from all this talk about coffee shops and commerce, because that's not really her focus. Her focus is housing. That's what her focus has always been, is housing. That's all she wants to develop in Maplewood, is housing. So let's find out what kind of new type of housing she has in mind for Maplewood.
Well, one of the things that I would like to see in the next 5 years would be a multi-generational housing project.
Yes.
That would be an opportunity, I think we could probably get some medical grant money for that, because it's just, there aren't cities doing that. And I think we have a real opportunity with our population, diverse population, to make that very simple.
Can you help me on that? Help me define multi-generational.
It's like the apartment or house that has the mother-in-law apartment, or has another accessory place for a child to live, or somebody else to live there. So it's not just one family. It could be the grandma and the grandpa, or the children.
Got it. Okay.
The new type of housing that she wants to have in Gladstone is multi-generational housing. Now, Mr. Mark Jenkins asked her, what do you mean by that? Well, then she explained that it would be where you can have several generations of the same family living together. I've thought about this, Mr. Berglund. How is this consistent with having a density of 50 units per acre for the Gladstone neighborhood?
I don't see how it works out. When she talks about multi-generational housing, I'm thinking the perfect example would be Hmong families on the east side of St. Paul and some of those big housing, big single-family houses there, which have many, many people living in, from grandma and the other side of the family possibly, maybe an uncle, mom and dad, and the kids, and they all share the responsibility of raising the family. So if Hmong families are continue to be huge families, and they have 15 people in a house, and they have single-family houses, maybe that works out.
As you indicated, single-family homes obviously are well suited for it, but that is inconsistent with Maplewood's big plan and change to the comp plan of 50 units per acre, because you cannot get 50 houses into an acre. You can get 6, maybe 8 if you squeeze them really tight and you have an association, but you're not going to get no 50 units per acre. And so here she is talking out of her ear inconsistently with what they've already done. It's part of that intentional decision-making, I think.
And of course, the most disturbing part about this whole thing is Melinda Coleman, who fashions herself as a housing expert, a housing authority, housing professional, that she brings value to the city because of her expertise and her ability to implement housing policy in a efficient and creative way. And of course, despite being, and she wants to be applauded for being such an expert and using the city of Maplewood as an experimental subject. The problem is I don't think Melinda Coleman, much less having that kind of authority, that kind of expertise, I don't think she has the presence of mind to actually be what in her imagination she has created herself to her professional image.
I looked up the definition for megalomania and a megalomaniac, and it's somebody who has a broad, big, huge vision, grandiose of what they can do and what they can be, and it's bigger, bigger, and better than what the reality truly is. I think you've just described another definition of megalomaniac, which concludes our news program of megalomaniacs, again, at work in Maplewood. So, Mr. Berglund, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And viewers, I hope that you enjoyed the inside bird's view of this meeting. See you again next week. Bye-bye.
You were a representative on the Rushland Bill as well, right? You are today, too?
Yeah.
When I was on Gateway Corridor, we talked about feeder routes to specific stops. Is the Frost one going to have some type of plans for a feeder route to bring people to that stop?
Are you talking about a bus route?
A bus route, yeah.
I think they're very conscious of that feeder line idea and to really make it an integrated system, that it's not just, one line.
One of the things with the timing is, if the timing works out, if Gladstone develops at, shall we say, a quicker pace than Rushland, maybe we push the issue of a feeder line to Frost, because we have the people, we have the amenities, we have the need for Metro Transit to bring them to that stop, as opposed to just serving.
That's all going to be part of the discussion.
Is that